The golden light stretched across the vinyl floor of Hillside Care like honey dripping from a spoon, and Maria knew it was time. She wheeled William to his usual spot by the window, where the Los Angeles skyline burned orange and purple against the dying day. His trembling hands reached for hers the moment she sat beside him, his clouded eyes suddenly bright with recognition that shouldn't exist in a mind eaten hollow by dementia. "Catherine," he whispered, his voice cracking like old leather, "you came back to me." Maria never corrected him anymore, because the truth would only break his heart again, and she'd broken enough hearts in her life, leaving her own children across an ocean she couldn't afford to cross. William's suite was nothing like the sterile rooms downstairs where most residents lived out their forgetting. Oil paintings lined the walls, expensive furniture gathered dust, and everything spoke of a life once full of power and choices. Yet every evening this wealthy man, who'd commanded boardrooms and built empires, became a boy again, desperate and small, clinging to Maria's hand like she was the only solid thing in his dissolving world. She'd learned his rhythms over the past 8 months, the way his lucidity ebbed and flowed with the sunset, how he became most himself in those brief moments when day surrendered to night. "I'm here," she told him, softly in the voice she used for her own children during video calls. "I'm right here with you." The ritual never changed, and Maria had come to need it as much as he did. She'd pour him chamomile tea that he'd forget he was holding, and she'd hum Filipino lullabies her grandmother taught her while the city lights flickered on below like scattered diamonds. Other nurses thought she was foolish, staying past her shift without extra pay, wasting tenderness on a man who wouldn't remember her face by morning. But they didn't understand how loneliness recognized itself, how two people separated from everything they loved could build a family from borrowed moments and mistaken names. In this country where she cleaned bodies and swallowed homesickness like bitter medicine, William's confusion had become her only honest connection. Tonight his grip tightened with unusual urgency, and tears traced the deep valleys of his weathered face. "Catherine, I broke my promise," he said, the words tumbling out in a confession he'd repeated dozens of times before, always forgetting he'd already confessed. "Gabriel needed me, and I failed him. I failed everyone." His other hand fumbled inside his robe, pulling out a creased photograph of a young boy with dark eyes and a hesitant smile. A child frozen forever in a moment William could no longer remember. Maria took the photo gently, studying those eyes that seemed to hold a question no one had ever answered, while William drifted away again into the fog, leaving only his tears behind as evidence that somewhere deep inside his heart still remembered how to break. Maria began documenting the pattern in a small notebook she kept hidden in her scrubs pocket, each entry time-stamped with William's fractured memories. The photograph of the boy appeared like clockwork during their sunset meetings, always clutched in William's trembling fingers as if it were a lifeline to something precious drowning in the depths of his forgetting. "Gabriel was waiting for me at the airport," he'd say one evening, his voice thick with ancient regret. Then the next night it became, "Gabriel needed money for school, but I was too proud." Each version contradicting the last, yet carrying the same unbearable weight. The details shifted like sand, but the anguish in his voice remained constant, a compass pointing toward some terrible truth his deteriorating mind could no longer articulate. Maria would lean close, her voice gentle as rain, asking, "Who is Gabriel, William?" But the question always pulled him back into confusion, his eyes glazing over as the present moment slipped through his fingers like water. The photograph itself had become worn at the edges from his constant handling, and Maria noticed things in it that William could no longer see. The boy stood before a tropical backdrop of palm trees and distant mountains, wearing clothes that seemed too large for his thin frame, his smile uncertain, as if he wasn't sure he belonged in the frame. Something about the image whispered of the Philippines, though Maria couldn't say why exactly, just a feeling in her bones that recognized home in the quality of light and landscape. She'd tried asking the other staff about Gabriel, but the day nurses only shrugged, mentioning that William had no visitors except his lawyer, who came quarterly to handle finances. Even the facility director seemed unaware of any family beyond the grandson listed as next of kin, who'd never once appeared during William's 18 months of residence. One particularly difficult evening, William's confusion erupted into panic, and he gripped Maria's shoulders with surprising strength, born of desperation. "I sent her away," he sobbed, the words erupting from some deep chamber of memory that dementia hadn't yet completely sealed. "Catherine begged me to find him, to make it right, but I was too ashamed. And now she's gone, and Gabriel thinks I never cared." His whole body shook with the violence of emotions his mind couldn't contextualize, tears streaming down his face while his words tangled into incoherence. Maria held him through the storm, rocking him like she rocked her own son during typhoon season before she left for America, whispering comfort in 2 languages while wondering what terrible choice had carved such permanent wounds into this dying man's soul. Maria's shifts officially ended at 7, but her body had learned a different clock, one measured in William's labored breathing and the particular quality of silence that preceded his nightmares. She began staying through the dark hours without logging the time, sitting in the vinyl chair beside his bed while the facility settled into its nocturnal rhythm of beeping monitors and distant footsteps. The administration never questioned her presence, perhaps assuming she was filling paperwork or covering for another nurse, and Maria didn't correct their assumptions because some acts of mercy existed outside the language of timesheets and policy. She'd brought a small pillow from home and a cardigan that still smelled faintly of her daughter's shampoo from their last video call, wrapping herself in these modest comforts while watching William's chest rise and fall in the amber glow of the nightlight. The nightmares always began the same way, with William's fingers twitching against the blankets as if reaching for something just beyond grasp. Then his breathing would accelerate into shallow gasps that preceded the words. I'm sorry, please forgive me," he'd cry out, his voice breaking with such raw anguish that it pierced through Maria's professional detachment, straight into the mother-shaped hollow in her chest. Sometimes he'd call out Catherine's name, sometimes Gabriel's, occasionally words in what sounded almost like Tagalog, but mangled by his American tongue and fragmenting mind. Maria would move to his bedside, taking his hand and grounding him with gentle pressure, speaking low reassurances until his eyes opened, seeing her without really seeing, mistaking her for ghosts he needed to confess to. "Shh, it's all right now. You're safe," she'd whisper, and sometimes he'd calm immediately, other times he'd grip her hand with desperate strength and continue apologizing to people who weren't there. It was during one of these episodes, while kneeling beside the bed to retrieve the blanket William had kicked to the floor, that Maria's hand brushed against something cold and metallic beneath the bed frame. Her fingers explored the darkness and found a rectangular box, small enough to hold in 2 hands, secured to the frame with what felt like wire twisted through the slats. The discovery sent electricity through her fatigue as she carefully freed it, the metal surprisingly heavy and marked with scratches that suggested frequent handling before it was hidden away. She held it in her lap, feeling the weight of secrets, noting the small combination lock that sealed whatever truth William's conscious mind could no longer protect, but his subconscious refused to release. Maria returned the box to its hiding place that night, but its existence burned in her thoughts like a flame she couldn't extinguish, transforming her vigil from simple compassion into something more complicated. She told herself she was respecting William's privacy, even as her mind catalogued every detail, the way the lock had 3 digits, how the box bore no markings or labels, why a man with nothing left to hide would chain his past beneath his bed. The next morning, as golden light filled the room, and William woke calling her Catherine again, smiling with heartbreaking tenderness at the woman he thought she was, Maria wondered if some promises were meant to stay broken, some boxes better left sealed, even as her hands ached with the weight of having held them. Gabriel arrived without warning on an evening when amber light poured through the windows like honey, his silhouette appearing in the doorway with such suddenness that Maria's breath caught in her throat. He wore expensive clothes that whispered money with every movement, a charcoal suit tailored to perfection, shoes polished to mirrors, and a watch that probably cost more than she'd earned in 6 months. But his face carried something no amount of wealth could soften, a hardness around the eyes that spoke of walls built high and reinforced often. Maria was adjusting William's pillows when she felt the weight of his stare, turning to find him examining her with the cold assessment of someone calculating threat levels. And before she could offer a greeting, his voice cut through the room's peaceful atmosphere like steel through silk. "You must be the nurse I've been hearing about," he said, each word precisely measured, and Maria understood immediately that hearing about implied investigation, that someone had been watching, reporting, building a case against her presence in this room. She straightened, smoothing her scrubs with hands that wanted to tremble, but wouldn't, meeting his gaze with the dignity her mother had taught her never to surrender regardless of who questioned it. "I'm Maria. Yes, I've been caring for your grandfather," she replied, keeping her voice level even as her heart hammered against her ribs, noting how Gabriel positioned himself between her and William, as though she were the danger in this equation. "I know exactly what you've been doing," Gabriel said, stepping closer with barely contained anger radiating from his expensive frame. "Staying late, making yourself indispensable, whispering God knows what into an old man's confused ear. And I want you to understand something very clearly. This manipulation ends now." The accusation landed like a physical blow, stealing the air from Maria's lungs as she processed the cruelty of his assumption that her midnight vigils and unpaid hours could be reduced to such ugly calculation, that her compassion could be mistaken for the worst kind of opportunism. William stirred in his bed, sensing tension through the fog of his deteriorating mind, reaching toward Maria with trembling fingers while murmuring Catherine's name like a prayer. Gabriel's jaw tightened at the gesture, something painful flickering across his composed features before the hardness returned, doubled, fortified against whatever feeling had briefly surfaced. "He doesn't even know who you are," Gabriel continued, his voice dropping to something more dangerous than shouting. "He thinks you're someone else, someone dead, and you're taking advantage of that confusion because you see dollar signs where there should be basic human decency. So, let me make this simple. Stay away from my grandfather, do your job during your scheduled hours, and nothing more, or I'll have you removed from this facility entirely." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke, poisoning the space where Maria had built her ritual of sunset conversations and gentle comfort, and she realized that no explanation would penetrate the armor of Gabriel's assumptions. She looked at William, then back at his grandson, seeing in both faces the same shape of jaw, the same deep-set eyes, genetics binding them across decades of apparent absence, and made a choice that defied both professional wisdom and self-preservation. "I understand what you think you see," Maria said quietly, gathering her cardigan and moving toward the door with her spine straight and her dignity intact. "But your grandfather deserves someone who stays when the nightmares come, whether you believe my reasons or not, and I won't abandon him because you've decided I'm the villain in whatever story you're telling yourself." She walked past Gabriel without waiting for response, leaving him standing in the golden light beside a man who'd been calling for him in his sleep, two strangers bound by blood and separated by everything else that mattered. Maria's hands trembled as she pressed the shutter button on her phone camera, the flash momentarily illuminating the metal box's scarred surface in the darkness beneath William's bed, her heart thundering so loudly she was certain someone would hear it echoing through the silent facility. She had returned well past midnight, when the hallways emptied of everyone except distant night staff, Gabriel's accusations still burning in her chest like swallowed fire, transforming her compassion into something more dangerous, a need to understand what secrets could turn a grandson so bitter. What broken promise could haunt a dying man's dreams with such relentless cruelty? The box felt heavier than its size suggested when she carefully photographed it from every angle, noting the tarnished lock and the initials engraved on top, letters worn smooth by decades of handling, and she wondered how many times William's fingers had traced those same grooves, while whatever contents remained sealed inside. Back in her small apartment, as dawn painted her walls the color of old pearls, Maria sat before her laptop, with coffee growing cold beside her, typing William's full name into search engines with the methodical determination of someone who'd crossed a line and refused to look back. The first articles appeared like ghosts materializing from digital graves, newspaper scans from 30 years prior with headlines that made her breath catch. Wealthy businessman loses only son in tragic accident, and there was William's face, younger but already carved with the same sorrow she recognized from his sleeping. Features. She clicked deeper, following threads of information through archived society pages and business journals, discovering a son named Jonathan who died at 28 in Manila. The circumstances described as a car accident on a rain-slicked road, but the articles never mentioned a wife, never spoke of anyone traveling with him, as though he'd been erased from the narrative entirely. Maria's pulse quickened when she found a smaller article buried in a Filipino newspaper's digital archives, one that mentioned Jonathan's vehicle had been registered to a local address in Quezon City, and that authorities had been unable to contact his family for several days after the accident. The photograph accompanying the article showed the wreckage, but in the background, barely visible, stood a young woman with her hand pressed against her mouth, her face blurred, but her posture speaking volumes about grief too enormous for the frame to contain. Something about the woman's stance reminded Maria of her own mother, the way loss could compact a body into something smaller than it should be, and she felt the story's weight settle into her bones like recognition. She printed every article, every photograph, every fragment of the past she could excavate from the internet's vast memory, spreading them across her kitchen table like puzzle pieces that refused to form a complete picture. Gabriel's face kept appearing in her mind, that expensive armor of anger covering something that looked dangerously close to abandonment, and Maria understood with sudden clarity that she wasn't researching William's past. She was excavating Gabriel's origin story, finding the moment where a family had broken apart and scattered its pieces across 2 continents, leaving everyone orphaned by silence and assumption. Gabriel arrived unannounced on a Thursday evening, his footsteps sharp and purposeful against the facility's linoleum floors, and he found Maria kneeling beside William's bed, with the metal box cradled in her arms like something precious and forbidden. Simultaneously, the air between them electrified instantly, his face transforming from controlled composure into raw fury as he recognized what she held, and Maria watched his hands curl into fists at his sides, the expensive watch on his wrist catching the lamplight like a warning signal, before she could explain or apologize or even set the box. Down gently, Gabriel lunged forward and seized it from her grasp with such force that her palms burned from the sudden friction, his voice emerging low and dangerous as he demanded to know what she thought she was doing, whether stealing from dying men was standard procedure for her kind of caregiver. Maria stood her ground, despite the trembling in her legs, meeting Gabriel's accusation with quiet defiance as she explained she wasn't stealing anything, only trying to understand what haunted William's nightmares, what promise broken decades ago still clawed at his consciousness during those terrible hours before dawn. Gabriel's laugh came out bitter and sharp like breaking glass. His fingers white-knuckled around the box, as he told her she had no right to his family's private pain, that her manufactured concern was nothing but manipulation dressed in scrubs and false compassion. The words should have wounded her, might have sent her fleeing, if she hadn't seen the raw anguish beneath his anger, the way his breath came too, quickly, and his eyes kept darting toward William's sleeping form, as though afraid the old man might wake and witness this confrontation. But William did wake, his eyes opening with unusual clarity that neither Maria nor Gabriel had witnessed before, his voice stronger than it had been in months, as he called his grandson's name without confusion or hesitation. Gabriel froze completely, the box nearly slipping from his hands as his grandfather reached toward him with trembling fingers, and Maria watched something crack in the younger man's carefully constructed armor when William spoke again, begging him with devastating simplicity to finally open it, to see what had been waiting for him all these years. The room seemed to contract around the three of them, the machines monitoring William's vitals, providing a steady rhythm to this moment of terrible anticipation. And Maria realized she was holding her breath as Gabriel's hands moved toward the tarnished lock. He opened the box slowly, his fingers shaking so violently that Maria instinctively stepped closer, despite the anger still radiating from his rigid shoulders, and together they stared at the contents that spilled across William's blanket like artifacts from an archaeological dig of the heart. Photographs of a beautiful Filipino woman holding an infant, letters written in William's younger handwriting, filled with words like mistake and shame and money, legal documents showing payments made to accounts in Manila, all evidence of a rejection so complete it had rewritten multiple destinies. Gabriel's breath emerged as a wounded sound, something between a sob and a gasp. And when he finally looked at his grandfather, Maria saw forgiveness and fury warring across his features, while William whispered the apology he'd been rehearsing in nightmares for 30 years. Gabriel's hands moved through the contents with increasing desperation, each photograph and letter revealing another layer of William's calculated cruelty, and Maria watched the younger man's face transform as he lifted a payment receipt, dated 30 years ago, with the memo line reading, "Final settlement, no further contact." The amount written there represented more money than Gabriel's mother had earned in her entire lifetime of factory work and street vending, yet William had considered it pocket change worth spending to erase what he viewed as his son's catastrophic mistake, loving a woman whose skin color didn't match the country club photographs. Maria's throat tightened as Gabriel found a letter from his own father, written weeks before the fatal accident, begging William to reconsider meeting his Filipino wife and unborn child. The ink smudged in places as though tears had fallen during its composition. William's voice cracked as he confessed he'd burned the original decades ago, that this was a copy he'd obtained later through lawyers, after his son's death had made reconciliation impossible and regret became his constant companion. The photographs of Gabriel's mother showed a young woman with kind eyes and careful posture holding her pregnant belly in some images and cradling an infant in others. And Maria recognized the particular heaviness in her smile that Filipino women wore when carrying burdens too large to name. Gabriel traced his mother's face with one finger, his jaw working silently, as William explained how he'd hired investigators to ensure the payments reached her, how he'd received reports of her struggling in Manila's poverty despite the money he'd sent, never understanding that his son's widow had too much pride to spend blood money from the man who'd rejected her family. The legal documents revealed William had established a trust fund for any potential grandchildren, but had attached conditions requiring they never contact him or use his family name, essentially offering financial support while demanding emotional extinction. Maria felt her own anger rising as she realized how completely William had engineered this separation, how he'd chosen preserving his social standing over knowing the grandson now standing beside his deathbed with trembling hands and wet cheeks. Gabriel's breakdown came suddenly, his expensive suit seeming ridiculous now, as he collapsed into the chair beside William's bed and pressed both palms against his eyes like a child hiding from monsters. His voice emerged raw and broken as he told them about growing up in a cramped apartment in Tondo, how his mother worked 3 jobs, while telling him stories about his American father who'd loved her completely, how she'd died from untreated pneumonia, still clutching a photograph of the man she'd married. William reached for Gabriel's hand with his own paper-thin fingers, and Maria witnessed something sacred and terrible as grandfather touched grandson for the first time. Decades of separation collapsing into this single moment of contact. The machines continued their steady beeping, marking time in a room where time had suddenly become both infinite and desperately scarce, where forgiveness and fury coexisted in the space between 2 men connected by blood and divided by choices that could never be unmade. The weight of revelation settled over them like dust after an explosion, and Maria found herself silently crying for the young mother in those photographs who'd raised her son alone, while an ocean away his grandfather had locked away his guilt in a metal box. Gabriel lifted his head and looked directly at William, his expression containing something more complex than either forgiveness or hatred, and when he finally spoke, his words carried the accent of his mother's homeland, blended with American education, purchased through her sacrifice. He asked the question that had haunted his entire existence, whether William had ever truly wanted to know him, whether some part of the old man had thought about the grandson growing up in poverty while he'd lived in comfort and isolation. William's answer came with the brutal honesty of someone facing final judgment, admitting he'd been too proud and too afraid, that he'd convinced himself his rejection was protection, rather than acknowledging it as the cowardice it truly was. Gabriel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he began describing the Manila neighborhood where he'd grown up, where open sewers ran between houses built from scavenged wood and corrugated metal, where the air always smelled of cooking fires and desperation, and where his mother would hold him during tropical storms that turned their single room into an island surrounded by rising floodwater. He spoke of watching her hands become gnarled from factory work, her fingers perpetually stained with dyes from the garment district where she sewed clothing destined for American department stores. The irony not lost on him that she'd spent her life creating comfort for people like William, while her own son wore donated shirts with other children's names written on the tags. Maria watched William's face crumble further with each detail, the old man's breath coming in shallow gasps that had nothing to do with his failing body, and everything to do with the crushing weight of consequences he'd spent decades trying to avoid. Gabriel described how his mother had kept a small wooden box, nothing like William's metal vault, filled with photographs of his father, letters written in English that she'd made Gabriel read aloud to practice the language she believed would someday connect him to his American heritage. The breaking point came when Gabriel revealed his mother's final days, how she'd grown delirious with fever in their apartment because they couldn't afford the hospital, how she'd called out for Gabriel's father in her delirium, believing herself young again and still loved by the American man whose family had rejected her like contaminated merchandise. He'd been 17 then, holding his mother's burning hand while neighbors pooled money for medicine that arrived too late, watching the woman who'd sacrificed everything slip away while still whispering apologies for not being good enough for the family she'd married into. Maria felt her own losses echoing in Gabriel's story, remembering her own children's faces during video calls where they tried to pretend everything was fine, the particular kind of separation that defined so many Filipino families scattered across the world in search of survival. Gabriel's voice cracked completely as he admitted he'd discovered William's existence only 2 years ago through an ancestry database, that he'd spent months debating whether to make contact before finally deciding His dying mother deserved someone to know she'd existed, that she'd mattered, that her love hadn't been the shameful mistake William had treated it as. William tried to speak, but could only manage broken fragments, his dementia temporarily held back by the emotional enormity of this moment, and he gripped Gabriel's hand with surprising strength, while tears carved paths down his weathered cheeks. Gabriel pulled away suddenly, standing and turning toward the window, where the sunset painted everything in shades of amber and gold, his shoulders shaking with the kind of grief that comes not from fresh wounds, but from realizing how completely unnecessary all this pain had been. He spoke to his own reflection in the glass, telling them how he'd put himself through university working nights as a janitor in the same buildings where his classmates partied, how every achievement felt hollow because the one person who would have celebrated wasn't there to see it, how success tasted like ash when purchased with his mother's suffering. Maria approached him slowly, her nurse's instincts recognizing someone on the edge of collapse, and when she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, Gabriel finally turned and looked at her with eyes that held both his mother's kindness and his grandfather's regret, a living bridge between two worlds that should never have been kept apart. The room held its breath as Gabriel returned to William's bedside, kneeling so their faces were level, and asked the question that truly mattered: whether his mother's memory meant anything now, whether William could acknowledge that the woman he'd paid to disappear had been worthy of love, worthy of family, worthy of the basic dignity he'd denied her. William's answer came not in words, but in action, as he reached for the photographs of Gabriel's mother and pressed them against his chest, his lips forming her name, Rosa, speaking it aloud for what was likely the first time in 30 years, giving her the recognition she died without receiving. Gabriel closed his eyes against fresh tears, and Maria witnessed forgiveness being born, not from forgetting but from finally devastatingly, allowing the full truth to exist in the space between grandfather and grandson, letting all that had been hidden emerge into the fading light. Maria's hands trembled as she reached into her worn leather bag, the same bag she'd carried from Manila 7 years ago, and withdrew a faded cloth-bound journal that seemed impossibly fragile against the weight of the moment it was about to carry. She'd debated for hours whether to reveal this connection, whether some threads of fate were meant to remain invisible. But watching Gabriel's raw grief and William's devastated recognition, she understood that truth. No matter how strange its path, deserved to be spoken. Her voice was soft but steady as she explained that every paycheck she'd earned in America she'd divided in half, sending one portion to her own children and the other to St. Catherine's orphanage in her hometown, the same crumbling compound where she'd grown up without parents, where the nuns had given her the education that eventually brought her to this very room. Gabriel's head lifted slightly, confusion flickering across his tear-stained face, and William's clouded eyes found hers with something approaching wonder, both men sensing they stood at the edge of another revelation that would reshape everything they thought they understood. Maria opened the journal with reverence, explaining how the orphanage's elderly director, Sister Mercedes, had given it to her 3 years ago during a visit home, saying it belonged to a young woman who'd volunteered there in the 1990s, a woman who'd helped care for the children while dealing with her own unspeakable heartbreak. The pages contained Rosa's handwriting, her thoughts poured out in a mixture of English and Tagalog, entries describing her work with orphaned children while pregnant with Gabriel, her determination to give these forgotten kids the love she prayed her own child would someday receive from his American family. Gabriel's breath caught audibly as Maria turned to a specific entry dated months before his birth, where Rosa had written about her fear that her son would grow up believing his mother hadn't been good enough, hadn't been worthy, and her desperate hope that somehow William's family would see past their prejudice to embrace the child she carried. Maria's voice broke slightly as she admitted she'd recognized Gabriel's story the moment he mentioned his mother's name, that she'd been carrying this journal for months, unsure whether the grandson Rosa had written about with such tender hope would ever appear. The revelation hung between them like a sacred thing, this impossible convergence of lives separated by oceans and decades, now bound together by a connection none of them could have predicted. Gabriel reached for the journal with shaking hands, his fingers tracing his mother's handwriting as fresh tears fell onto pages already stained by time and tropical humidity. Reading her words about dreaming her son would become someone who helped others, the way she wished she'd been helped. Maria explained that Rosa's volunteer work had inspired the orphanage's medical clinic, that children were alive today because of systems his mother had helped establish, that her legacy had been building itself quietly in the place she'd turned to when William's family had turned her away. William made a sound, somewhere between a sob and a prayer, understanding now that the woman he'd dismissed as unworthy had possessed more grace than he'd ever managed, and that Maria, this nurse who'd shown his own final days such unexpected compassion, was the spiritual heir to the kindness his prejudice had tried to destroy. Gabriel looked between Maria and his grandfather, his expression transforming as anger finally gave way to something more complex, a recognition that healing sometimes arrives through the most unexpected messengers, and that his mother's spirit had perhaps guided Maria to this room, to this moment, to ensure that forgiveness could finally take root where bitterness had grown for too long. William's final days possessed a crystalline quality, as though the fog that had obscured his mind for years suddenly lifted to reveal one last landscape of absolute clarity, and in those precious hours he moved with surprising purpose despite his failing body. He asked Gabriel to bring his lawyer, and together they sat in that sun-filled room where so many sunsets had been witnessed, drafting documents that would transform Maria's impossible dream of reuniting with her children into concrete reality, establishing funds and legal guarantees that would bring her son and daughter from Manila. Maria protested through tears, insisting she wanted nothing from him, but William grasped her hand with unexpected strength and told her that Rosa had taught him something he'd refused to learn when she was alive, that love recognizes no borders, that families torn apart by prejudice and pride deserve champions who will fight to bring them home. Gabriel added his own voice, promising he would personally navigate every immigration hurdle, every bureaucratic maze, that he would treat Maria's children as the family his mother had never been allowed to claim. The old man smiled then, really smiled, and whispered that perhaps this was the promise he'd been trying to remember, the one his broken mind had been reaching for through all those confused evenings, not to bring back what was lost, but to prevent another mother from losing everything. William passed 3 nights later, with both Maria and Gabriel at his bedside, his final words a mixture of his late wife's name and Rosa's, as though in death the loves and regrets of his life were finally reconciled into a single whispered benediction. The funeral was small but profound, attended by care facility staff who'd witnessed the transformation in room 212, and afterward Gabriel asked Maria if she would help him scatter some of his grandfather's ashes in the Philippines, at the orphanage where Rosa had poured out her broken heart into service. They traveled together 2 months later, and standing in St. Catherine's courtyard surrounded by children whose lives continued the legacy Rosa had begun, they both understood they were witnessing something beyond simple closure. This was redemption's slow work, turning old wounds into unexpected bridges. Sister Mercedes blessed them both, saying Rosa would have laughed at the mysterious ways grace moves through the world, connecting strangers across decades until they become the family that prejudice tried to prevent. Maria's children arrived in Los Angeles 4 months after William's death, and Gabriel was there at the airport when she finally wrapped her arms around them after 5 years of separation, their tears mixing as families torn apart were made whole. He'd found Maria a larger apartment near his own, had enrolled her daughter in the same school where he volunteered, had created space in his life for this unexpected family that shared no blood but everything that mattered. Loss transformed into love, forgiveness earned through the hardest honesty, and the understanding that sometimes our deepest wounds become the places where new life takes root. They visited William's grave together on Sundays, bringing flowers and stories, teaching Maria's children about the complicated old man whose final act of grace had given them this impossible gift. Gabriel would touch the headstone and silently thank both his grandfather and his mother, understanding finally that inheritance isn't just what we receive, but what we choose to pass forward, and that the truest families are those we build from the broken pieces of our separate histories. Can healing truly begin until we face the ones we've hurt? Subscribe to witness more stories where forgiveness changes everything.